I'm Ira Plato from Science Friday, live from the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco, California. When I first began reporting on science, it's hard to believe it's been over 50 years that I started reporting on science. Going back to the first Earth Day in 1970, I really could not have ever imagined how dramatically the landscape could change in just a few decades, in just a few years, from the way research is conducted to how we as journalists bring those stories to the public. And before I welcome my colleagues on the stage, I want to emphasize that thoughtful science journalism has never been more crucial than it is today. And we're going to talk about why that is, and it's probably evident for you as consumers of science news, as we face really unprecedented global challenges that require the public to understand science and how science happens, which they really don't understand it very much. But the dirty little secret about science is the public loves science. They love to hear about things, how things work. They love to hear about advances if you tell it to them in the way that they can understand it. And so tonight we're going to talk about presenting science through journalism, some of the challenges, some of the rewards, what to look forward to, and I'm joined by three Bay Area science writers to discuss all of this, what the frontier looks like and the challenges in reporting science in these next 3 or 4 years, how we can rebuild trust with the public, and we'll be taking your questions later in the evening. There's a microphone up there, and we'll be taking questions from our audience on the live stream. You know, I usually introduce my guests myself. I'm going to have you introduce yourselves tonight. So please, Annalee, why don't you start?
All right. My name's Annalee Newitz. My pronouns are they, them. I am a science journalist, but I also am a science fiction author. And my most recent nonfiction book, I mostly write books. I'm really interested in the way that science and culture and history interact. So my most recent book is called Stories Are Weapons, and it's a history of culture war and psychological war in the United States. And I have a science fiction book coming out later this year called Automatic Noodle, which is about a group of robots who open a noodle restaurant in San Francisco. And I also am the co-host of a podcast, which is about science and culture, and it's called Our Opinions Are Correct.
It's amazing. I'm Ezra David Romero. I'm a climate reporter at KQED. My beats are the absence and excess of water, so that can be sea level rise, that can be a drought, that can be violent weather, that could be a tornado that almost happened in December for all of us here in San Francisco. I've been a climate journalist I just turned 12 in my journey, and I've been in California my whole life, and I've been in San Francisco for about 4 years. So you might hear me on the radio, you might see a social video, or you might see a digital story, or even a podcast episode at KQED.
Wow, it's hard to follow that. But I'm Navina Sadasivam. I'm a reporter and editor at GRIST. GRIST is a nonprofit newsroom that covers climate change. I've been reporting on the environment, on climate change for more than a decade at this point, similar to you, Ezra. And my beats are primarily the oil and gas industry and toxic chemicals. So a lot of doom and gloom on this beat, sadly. But
Are there any stories that you're writing about now or any topic, material, areas that excite you more than others? Annalee, first, I'll go with you. If you could choose anything to write about on your desert island question, right? What would you do?
Okay, well, I'm working right now. I've just started working on a book that is focused on archaeology, which is something that I write about a lot. And it's about, it's an ancient history of parties and celebrations. So I've gotten really interested in how people partied 5,000 years ago. And it's actually...
Do you have to party now to see how it compares?
I mean, it helps to have a little familiarity with how parties work. But I get very excited about, people who find, for example, ancient drinking vessels. This is one way this is sort of the smallest unit of partying, is the drinking vessel. And some cultures, particularly this culture of Minoans on Crete, they manufactured so many drinking vessels. And the scientists I talked to, one of them actually said, they have too many wine cups. So I find that's a story I'm
You
working
can
on.
have too many wine cups.
Apparently so. So that is a story I'm very interested in because it kind of gives us a sense of how people are interacting in the past.
Ezra, what's
That's
your
great.
favorite?
I'm exploring the notion, like this nexus of being queer and all the people who work in the climate field that are gay, trans, bi, lesbian. And there's a ton, like so many scientists I interview are gay or queer. And I want to like learn more about them and why and like tell their stories a bit more. That's something I'm just starting on. And I just told a group of environmental journalists at this environmental journalism conference I was at in Arizona to party more. So they
Yeah.
can.
I think there's an overlap too.
Yeah.
Like,
I was going to
be
say,
more-
you two could collaborate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So-
Be
We
more
match.
queer, party more, and then study the environment.
Exactly.
Naveen?
My answer also has a little bit to do with partying, like international parties, conference of parties on
Yeah.
climate change. Did I make the connection there?
Yes.
So I've become, in the last couple of years, very interested in international climate negotiations. Obviously, climate change is a global problem that requires global solutions. And so I've had the privilege of attending some of these conferences, and especially in this day and age where we're seeing this shift in global power to the east. What does that mean for climate change? What does that mean for climate solutions? How are countries going to come together under this new global order? That's all very exciting and interesting to me. And so that's my jam.
Do you find, and I have found in my career, that as opposed to what most people think, the audience loves science? It's not that, you see it all the time, but
Yeah.
people don't like it, they hate it. Did you find that true also?
Yeah, I think people love science. They love like the more sciencey, nerdy the story is.
Yeah.
Often, the more people are going to click it. Especially if you're not going to lose them with all the terminology, but if you're going to show them what's really cute about this or why this matters to their lives.
Yeah, I think that, people want a sense of wonder in their lives, and I think science can give us that. And hopefully, as we explain something like the beauty of an ecosystem, we can also teach people about how to care for that ecosystem, and that's what kind of gets into the important issues around climate change.
Yeah, and fundamentally, I feel like people are drawn to good stories. So if you can find a good science story there that at the heart of it is about a person or some new technology that they've discovered, and you can center that in your storytelling, I think people are going to be drawn to it. And often people don't realize that what they're reading is a science story in the first place.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Right. Right. Do you feel that you have to make a story like that out of your subject matter, so that people are interested in it and can understand it?
especially with, let's say, take international climate negotiations, right? Like really dense, really wonky, people are arguing over ifs and buts and thes and like little words. And what I found helpful is to center the people doing that work. Who are the people who are showing up every year to have these conversations and find ways to progress, right? So it has helped as a storytelling tool for sure.
Has there been consistency in the audience that you serve about what they expect to hear? The kinds of stories they're in, has evolved over time? I remember, when I first started reporting in science way back in the late 60s, early 70s, it was all about the space race, right? Getting to the moon, and people wanted to hear, and most of the science reporters were talking about space. And then the 70s was the environmental movement, right? And the EPA and things like that.
I think for me, I work with multiple editors at NPR and at KQED and different public radio shows. It really comes down to the editor and what that organization is wanting. Like some editors really want stories about hope, and I'm not that much of a hopeful person. So I have to change my view a little bit and tell a story in that way. Other editors want something to be super sciencey driven, get into the scientist's mind and tell it through that way. I think the editor for me often dictates the way I might tell a story.
It's interesting, though, because what you were saying about some editors and some publications want hope. And I think that maybe one of the shifts we've seen is that it's less about the topic, whether it's space or AI, and more about vibes.
Yeah.
You'll see someone say oh no, I really want a story that's going to make people learn a lesson about how bad that they have treated the environment. You know what I mean? Or they'll be yeah, tell us something about how we're going to fix everything with AI. And so that's a different...
Well, do you ever push back? against your editor.
Oh,
Sure.
yeah.
I often push back and say, like, there's no hope to this story. Or there is. Or like, we have to give me some more time to come back to it.
Or we should talk to a different group of people.
Yeah.
That's like a big pushback that I will do is like, no, we can't just talk to this one small group of scientists. We need to talk to people who are on the front lines, who are dealing with these issues, not just in the lab.
One really common question that an editor will often ask, when you've like spent months working on something, reporting on something, is like, okay, well, what's the solution? Where is the solution? Like, tell me what the solution is to this.
Where's the line?
They want a black and white answer.
Yes, exactly. And I think often the answer is, well, the people in power need to step up and do something about it. Like that's the one-line answer, and there isn't very much more reporting to do on that front. And that can be frustrating, I think, sometimes for editors to hear, but that's the reality.
There's usually a range of solutions. I work on a lot of water stories, and there's not just one way to fix the issue. There's multiple ways, and so you almost have to have a graph like listing out all those things.
Right. I remember when we started Science Friday back in 1991. We're in our 34th year now. Excuse me. We were talking about the asteroids wiping out the dinosaurs. It was sort of a new topic back then. And I had one of the scientists on talking about the asteroid, and then the phone rang, literally taking calls live, and a biologist, a Nobel Prize-winning biologist, was calling into the show to debate the scientist. And he said, I got you. You won't answer the phone when I call, but now you're stuck in the studio, and I can ask. And he said, I don't need your method, your meteor method. I can explain it biologically. And they went on back and forth having an interesting discussion. And the first piece of mail that came in the week after was, remember, Barbara from New Jersey saying, I'm shocked. Scientists disagreeing with each other.
Oh, yeah.
Doesn't science know everything? No, like it's in a book, right? You face that kind of stuff all the time. Totally.
I definitely feel that because I think often readers want certainty. Like they want to know, should I drink coffee? Should I not drink coffee? Is a glass of wine okay before bed? Is it not okay before bed? And they want clear yes or no binary sort of answers. And often the best we can offer is a very nuanced, complex answer that depends on your specific set of factors, right? And so
which is also our job, right? Totally. Our job is to provide, looking at the issue from all these different ways and then presenting that story from all these different ways, by talking to the people from the different sides. So
it's interesting. Go ahead, Anna.
I would say one of the things that's really great about having a beat where you're focusing on a topic over a long period of time is that you can also show your audience how the scientific consensus is changing, which is frustrating because people are like, but wait, I thought we knew this already.
Right.
But if you can keep following the story, one of the stories I've followed for a really long time is the peopling of the Americas. How did human beings get to the Americas? And there have been 30 different versions of that story, and it's always changing, and it's still changing today. And I'll always get angry emails from readers being like, excuse me, but what about the Bering Land Bridge? And I'm like, yes, okay, but
there's always a but.
Yeah, there's and also multiple ways, that people got here, but the story is always changing, and that's what's beautiful about science, right? Is that when we see a truth, we tackle it and we say well, actually, but maybe it's not quite that way. Maybe we should reach a new provisional truth.
I think in science reporting, in climate reporting, we're often doing stories about a study that's coming out, and it's like an update about a thing.
Yes.
And so, and we also have time limits. Often I have 45 seconds to tell this story, or I have 600 words to tell this story in a digital way, and I have those confines from an editor, so you're only going to get a bit of what's happening. So the but email, you're like, yes, and we'll do another story. It's if you look at the body, my entire body of work, you'll get a different answer. But that's not what people are listening to when you're listening to NPR in the car you're driving. You're you can't really search that in that moment. Or please don't, because you're driving.
For those of you who do multimedia, podcasts, radio, scripting, writing, Annalee, how do you change the storytelling depending on that medium you're using?
Oh, absolutely. For sure. Yeah. And I mean, when I'm doing a short column versus writing a book, it's a completely different way of tackling the material. And, as Ezra's saying, if you're doing a short radio segment, you're limited. You can't kind of give all the context. And one of the reasons why I kind of moved into book writing is because it does let you give this huge amount of context and backstory. It lets you take people, like your readers can go with you into the lab or into the field, and you can show people, like, this is actually how scientists figure things out. Because I think in our era of people being so skeptical of science, it's really important for us, and I know you guys do this in your work too, to like explain how the science is actually done. Like, yes, a person actually went out into the field with a laser and measured this thing, and here's what they measured, and here's how they figured out how much carbon loading there is or how old something is. And so with a book, with a long piece, you can do that. With a short piece, you just have to get the news out, which is super important.
I mean, there's like, my job is doing daily stories, like you hear on NPR, like the 45-second story, which also might be a 500-word digital story. But then we do features where I get to do that same kind of work, where I get to go out with the scientists and that's what I did today. I went out to Alameda and Oakland, and I was with these scientists who are researching sea level rise and how that's going to impact the entire, from like the Bay Bridge down to the airport, through the Port of San Francisco. And that was so fun to be with like the main scientists of the port and go to all these areas. And now I get to put that like fun, juicy stuff that we talked about into a story, right?
Well, that brings me to a topic for Navina, because I know you write a lot about toxic chemicals.
Yep.
How do you convey the relative risk of these things to the audience?
It's such a tough thing, because I think one thing that's changed in the last decade to 2 decades is people's attention spans and their ability to sort of stick with a story, right? So even if we have you for 45 seconds, and I know how long people are spending on my stories. We have those analytics, and it's best case scenario for a very long piece, it's 2 minutes, guys. Like, that is the goal. I get a gold star every time that happens. But so when you're talking about toxic chemicals, which are, by the way, all around us, and I'm trying to communicate the relative risk of one specific chemical, I need to be able to explain, like, how does this compare to you driving your car to work every day? I need to be able to give you context as to, like, how can you assess what your exposure level is to this chemical? And then I need to sort of break down, well, what are the effects on human health to the best of our understanding, the best science we have right now on this one chemical? What do we know about the long-term effects and the short-term effects? And so all of that can be very challenging to sort of weave into a narrative. And the best ways that I've found are to find people who have been in those positions, who can describe the health effects for themselves, and then weave it into what a scientist knows and what the epidemiologists are telling us about what the risk actually is. But it's such a tricky balance.
Yeah. And I want to talk about change subjects a little bit and talk about the elephant in the room about science reporting now. And that is the attack on science and science research and the withdrawal of funds, the cutting of staff. We all know what I'm talking about. How much time do you feel that you need to devote to the politics of science now versus the beat that you're covering in specific topics? I know at Science Friday, we've actually had a discussion, have many discussions each week, about do we cover this or do we do the basic research of cephalopods and stuff, something like that? Yeah. Do you follow that same problem? Do you have that same...
Well, my workload has entirely changed. I mean, I was covering, before the election and after the election, I was covering multiple things. And I'd say for the past 3 months, I've mostly covered like NOAA cuts, EPA cuts, meteorologists being cut, just cuts. And some of the ethics of that. And so I'd say like and now I really want to sink my teeth into something else and work on something else. But it's also a great moment to be a journalist. You get to document this moment in time, and you get to like bring these stories that are happening to people in your community to light. And so in some way, I feel like if I'm not reporting those stories, I'm not doing my job. So this is also a great moment to be a journalist. You can bring awareness to these stories, especially if no one else is telling them.
I'm just relieved, honestly, because I think all of us know that science is political. It's always been political. I mean, we know, even looking back hundreds of years, like, why the heck was Galileo put in prison? Well, because science is political, right? He was making politicians nervous and making the church nervous. And so it's nice to be in an era where we can all just be like, yes, we admit that science is political, and now we can cover it as something that's affected by politics. And so I think I totally agree with what Ezra's saying about how this is a great time to be covering that stuff, particularly because I think all of us do cover topics that touch up against governance and regulation. But I have to say that one of the things that I've had to do in our new era is when I'm not writing about politics overtly, is that I often find myself telling stories where I'm kind of hiding politics inside of it.
Right.
So like in say a book about ancient parties, like you can think about the party part, which is really fun, the archaeology part, which is really fun, but also how governments use parties to get people to buy into certain beliefs. Like if you buy everybody in your town a free beer, they might vote for you. They might, party. If they party with you, they might kind of entertain the idea of joining your clan. And so I find myself telling these stories where I'm like, well, I'm still secretly talking about politics, but I'm also just talking about cool stuff from history, So it's kind of either being really overt or being sneaky.
Yeah, it's kind of become inescapable, and I completely agree with you. Science has always been political. And I just want to highlight for a second how these first 100 days have changed, at least reporting for me, and I probably for both of you as well. First of all, folks are much more hesitant to pick up the phone and talk to a reporter. So a lot of scientists, researchers receive funding from the federal government. And so they are terrified that if they respond to an email from a journalist, even to say, no, I can't talk to you, that might somehow jeopardize their funding. A lot of folks are on Signal being very, very cautious about what they say. And, previously, I would often talk to researchers, and it was kind of, it was sort of a rote question, are you comfortable talking on the record? And the answer was almost always yes. And now it is almost always no. Can we start on background or off the record? And then I will approve certain quotes, and, we can have a discussion about what can be on the record. And so that has fundamentally just kind of shifted.
Even with scientists who have tenure.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Less so for me with tenured professors. There's a professor I worked with a lot of times at Berkeley, and they're great talking to me. One of the younger professors who's not tenured is more hesitant to talk to me. But our KQED's been having conversations about, like, can we put in sources without attributing them and things? And we have a stance of try not to. Work as hard as you can to find someone who can say the thing. It's like spend the extra time. And I found that most of the time I can find somebody who will speak on the issue.
Will they say, I want to be off the record? Don't quote me on this, but this is the state of where our research is?
I'm trying to do less of those conversations overall, because at some point, especially if no one will talk to you, then you're stuck with a story in your mind that you can't tell. And so I might do one conversation with someone off the record, but no more than that, just because otherwise it's kind of pointless at times.
Annalee, do you face the same issue?
Absolutely. I was just talking to some healthcare researchers at Yale who are having to completely, this was, I'm not going to tell anyone's name because this was kind of a casual conversation, and they were saying they have to rework all of their grants because they can't use the word genetic diversity, even though they're studying kind of population genetics, which requires you to look at, a whole bunch of different genomes in a whole bunch of different people. But the word diversity has been red flagged, obviously, when it comes to federal funding. And that's just one of a list of about 50 words that people can't use regardless of the context. And I also have found I've had a big uptick in researchers contacting me on Signal and saying all right, well, I can't talk to you, on the record, but just FYI, this is happening in my department, or this is what's going on. And so it is frustrating to not be able to quote people, or to only be able to say I talked to some folks who are doing a thing at a place. But we want to protect our sources. We do this because we love science and we want scientists to keep being able to work. So we're not going to just out people. We're going to protect their identities.
But do you ever see anybody volunteering to come forward with, I really want to talk about this?
I think so. I just last week and a half ago, I was telling the stories about the EPA and the potential layoffs. They had layoffs, just here in San Francisco, the EPA's District 9 headquarters. They laid off people, but then they had this rally on Earth Day, right, where something like 200 people came out that were many of them EPA workers, and like many of them spoke. So I think people are getting to the point where they're like, we're coming under attack so much that if we don't say something now, then we're closing our mouths to what we need to do. And so they're beginning to speak.
Speaking of beginning to speak, good segue. We have a microphone here in the audience if you'd like to ask questions, and I invite you all to take part in asking those questions. Also out on the internet, we are live streaming this, and we will be taking questions from the internet, and I will bring them up. Diana Plasker, our producer, will bring them up here, and we'll see what we come up with. Does your audience want to know things? Do they let you know what they would like to know, sometimes by mail or whatever? Say, why don't you cover more of this or this kind of stuff?
I feel like mostly on social media, people will tell me, like, why aren't you covering it this way or this way? Why'd you leave this out? Sometimes I get blind phone calls from people. I tend to, like, make all phone calls go to voicemail at this point in time to, like, look at the message. Things like that.
All right, we have already reaction from a question from out there in the ether. Here's a question. What are some of the biggest challenges facing science journalists today? I mean, we've been talking about the challenge. If you had to rate, I hate these kinds of questions, the biggest, not that this questioner is wrong.
I think funding is a big thing.
What's that?
I think funding is a big thing for many journalists. Lots of science journalists work for smaller organizations, nonprofits, where the funding might be threatened because of the state of the economy overall. And we've seen great reductions in staff across America, across the country in journalism. So I think having a position sometimes is the greatest threat.
Yeah, it's having a position at, say, a newspaper as a science journalist is very rare now, and same at any news organization. And that used to be a mainstay. Like, you would have a science section, or you would at least have a group of science reporters. And so I think one of the big problems that I see, and many of my colleagues see, is that people who are general reporters, like people who are kind of reporting on news and a bunch of other things, will get assigned to science stories without any kind of background in how to write about science. Yeah. And the result is that you get science stories that sometimes misrepresent the information, or they're very credulous. They'll cover a story that's really more of a press release. Like, as journalists, we get a lot of press releases, and sometimes you'll get something like, a chocolate company sponsored a story about how chocolate is good for you. And that's a fun story, right? But if you're not a trained science journalist, you won't necessarily be able to tell, actually, this is just a kind of a nothing burger. It was a chocolate company that wanted that story. And so you get a lot of kind of spurious science stories. So I think that's a big problem, is sort of the non-science story.
I've been facing that for decades.
I bet, yeah.
And it used to create problems where I would read a story in the newspaper covered by a general assignment reporter, and I remember one that said, we've discovered a galaxy that's 1,000 light years away, and we know how far it is because we bounced a radar signal off of it. This was in
Amazing.
A major newspaper. And of course, my editors wanted me to go look at that, and I did also. Okay, questions in the audience? Yes, go ahead.
Well, thank you all. This is fascinating. Ezra.
Hi.
If you cover water, do you cover rivers?
Yeah, I've covered rivers, everything from like Guerneville, up in Guerneville, the Russian River.
Give us a river story.
Okay,
well, let me get the music going first. And then
somebody like cue the water sound. Yeah, I reported, the last river story I worked on was about the Russian River and salmon. Basically, like everyone who drives a car, this like toxic dust comes off the tires, and it gets into the water and kills salmon. There's a bill that Diane Pappin tried to pass this past year, didn't pass, that would like limit the amount of toxic dust into like rivers like the Russian River. And they were going to plant like marshes and things like that. There's certain plants that like that toxin, and so that's the last river story I worked on.
What about drying up rivers or overflowing rivers and climate change in rivers?
Yeah, I worked on a story in the past 2 years about the Lake Tule Lake in the Central Valley, where I grew up. I grew up in the Central Valley. I remember we had so much rain on snow events, that Tule Lake formed again in the Central Valley. And I went out there and I think we did a radio story, but then we also did like some social video stories because it was just so visually appealing. Like you just drove and the road disappeared into a lake. So that was cool.
Do you find that if you do a story, you have to do it for the other media that you're working in? If you do a radio story, okay, I have to do something
No.
for the website, I have to do something for a podcast.
I'm often thinking of what the story, how it lends itself first. Because at KQED, we have radio, we have digital, we have podcasts, we have social video. So I might do a story. One of my most trafficked stories last year was a social video that we had about a levee bursting on purpose down near Redwood City, where they restored this marshland that used to be like a toxic site. And it was so visually stunning, and it had millions of views. And that same story in our digital format was like no one looked at it. It was just, so I think we chose correctly to have it be a social video story. So it really depends on what the story is, and sometimes an editor just wants it. So you have to put it on the radio or you have to do it in digital.
Yeah, your editor wants a story a certain way.
Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah. Speaking of which, yes.
Interest in pursuing the question of science and politics, and we've got 4 people with a lot of experience, and it's really great to hear from you. What I want to hear is, I'm speaking from the perspective of a science publisher and a writer, not a science writer, but a humanities writer. What do you see going on out there among all the forces, institutions, people that are being destroyed by a murderous crew? People's lives are at stake, and I appreciate that people at the EPA wanted to stand up, but what do you see people trying to do to stop what's going on? Because everybody knows it's an existential moment for the human race and for the planet itself. I often think the planet will exist when we're gone, and we'll probably benefit from it. Talking about not being hopeful. But anyhow, what do you think?
Go ahead, Annalee.
Well, one of the things that's happening a lot, and happened actually during the last Trump regime as well, was a lot of researchers and amateur scientists are working on saving data that's being flushed right now. And so places like the Internet Archive, which is based here in San Francisco, are doing a lot to help host that data. So a lot of it is environmental data from satellites that are focused on the planet as opposed to focused out into space, which is, of course, this current group of politicians loves the idea of outer space because they want to colonize Mars. But they aren't interested in focusing on the place where we currently live. And so that's a huge effort that's going on. And then, of course, I think all of us have been reading about how many universities are now banding together to try to push back on the federal government trying to take control of certain departments at different universities. So those are 2 ongoing efforts that make me hopeful about how we're going to be able to at least retain that data, which is incredibly important.
If I could just add to that, I think the archiving of data is so important, and people who went through all of that during the first Trump term were better prepared this time around. Mm-hmm. They saw it coming and had all the web servers and archives kind of ready to go. What I also have heard from EPA staffers who've been offered buyouts, for instance, is that there is just no way that they're leaving voluntarily. And so they are also kind of banding together internally. EPA staff, for instance, have a union. So they're all kind of organizing to the extent that they can to push back at what's happening.
I was going to say organizing is probably the biggest thing I'm seeing, everything from like the EPA to locals. I live in the Mission District here in San Francisco. There's like a protest every Saturday over everything going on in the world right now. And I think tons of people are protesting. They're sending letters to their senators. They're making phone calls. I think all of that is helping in the long run.
Yeah, I was about to say that there are all these pushbacks happening on the streets. People are taking to the streets. As someone who lived through the Vietnam War era and watched protests and covered riots and things like that myself, it looks a little bit like that era, not as heavily now. But there are demonstrations in every state, cities in every state, where people are pushing back. And over the years, when we were covering controversial issues, I would get listeners who ask me, what do I do? And I just say, vote. If you want to have your voice heard, you can protest, but you also just can't show up on the street. You have to show up in the voting booth if you want things to change. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for being here today, and a lot of experience and a lot of skills. So I have two questions that is a central theme. I'm a public school educator, and my first question is, I know the middle person you mentioned about trying to find hope versus not hope and stuff like that. But when it comes to guiding and supporting instruction and education towards, young people, we do need hope. So I was just wondering, any advice on staying hopeful with solutions, especially to young people less than the age of 15. And then my second question is, I know that a lot of news and climate news and also science information for young people in their age, like 18, 20, and to 30s, they get a lot of that news from social media. And there is an issue with social media sites, I don't know, fake news, fake information that is not correct. And how do we tell the difference between correct and, not so correct?
I can take.
Thank you.
Yeah. KQED has an education department where we go into schools across the Bay Area, and they teach media literacy. They also have courses on climate change and things like that. That they actually take stories that I've done and kind of rewrite them for a younger audience or use them in different ways. And so you can either email me or you can email someone else. You can email me about it. I can connect you to the people at KQED who are doing that stuff with youth. And when I say I'm not hopeful, I'm just not hopeful in the greater world and in reducing climate change, because we're seeing this at a global scale. What I am really hopeful about is the daily work that I see scientists doing, that I see environmental justice groups doing. They're all working their butts off, right, making sure their communities are safe and well. And so I think that's where I draw the most hope from, is what's happening in rooms like this.
Absolutely. And to add to that also, I think young people especially are very worried about climate change and the future of the planet. And one of the things that has emerged in the last 10 years is the clean energy revolution. The pace at which that has accelerated just in the last decade is incredible. And so I think, one of the things that we try to do at GRIST is not just do hard-hitting accountability investigative work that is highlighting the problem, but also uplifting what the solutions are and telling stories about the people who are trying to find those solutions. And that doesn't mean cheerleading for solutions, but taking a very hard critical look at groups that are trying to decarbonize various sectors, various industries, and trying to spotlight the changes that are happening there.
I also think on social media, young people are very aware that some of these things are fake. When I talk to young people, they're like, okay, this is fake. They realize it. But I also think that's why we're trying to do more social videos and things like that of my work and doing it in that way. Because, for example, I'm 38 and none of my friends listen to KQED or NPR, right? I'm older now, right? And people are not listening to that. My friends aren't. But they will see a social video that I post online. And so if we tell the same story in different ways, we get the same message out across the different groups of people.
Yeah, on that tip, what I was going to mention was that if you're looking for hope, especially for younger people, this is one of the reasons why I'm so interested in science fiction, because it allows, one of the things that we are missing when we try to do stories where we're like, okay, the solutions in the next 5 minutes are X. We also need a bigger vision that's guiding us toward a future that's 50 years from now or 500 years from now, because people are going to be here at that time. And so there's a couple of movements in science fiction that sometimes that gets called solar punk or hope punk. And if you look under those terms, you'll find a lot of writers who are writing very scientifically grounded work about the environment and about the human future based on things like clean energy, based on the Green New Deal, for example. And that can help kind of be a guiding principle. That what we're aiming for is this kind of imaginary world in 500 years where we do have clean energy and where we do live sustainably. But in the meantime, the other thing that's really great about teaching with science fiction is it lets you teach the students the difference between fiction and nonfiction. And that is something that we don't get taught. And that gets right back to what Ezra's saying about social media has both. It has fake stuff and it has real stuff. And learning to understand the difference through story can be incredibly helpful. I mean, I taught a course on media studies last year, a college level course, and some of the students in the class had not heard of the idea that there was fiction and nonfiction. Those were just terms of art for them. And it isn't because they were ignorant, it was just because those just weren't ideas that they'd been exposed to. And so I think it's important to have that language so that they aren't just saying fake news, but saying no, that's fiction, and this is nonfiction.
I want to pick up on that point because it's something that I've been thinking about for many years as someone who's gone through the educational system. I'm not an educator. I don't profess to be an expert in this, but I've been through all the levels of education, an engineering degree, all the way up from two things I discovered and talking to scientists too, was if you ask a scientist what got them through their adolescent period when most kids are thinking about something else rather than their work and science, it's having a mentor, right? It's having someone who held them after school, like my 8th grade science teacher, Mrs. Pfeffer, had a science club, after school. She's named right out of Central Casting, or it was your mother. And I asked scientists, well, my mother took me to the planetarium every Saturday and kept me going. And picking up on the other point is, I think we don't teach science. We teach science too much like you're going to be a scientist.
Yeah.
Like you're going to be, we teach some music appreciation and we teach art appreciation, and we know you're not going to be Yo-Yo Ma or Salvador Dali, but we teach you why it's important to understand music, how to understand it, how to know what good art is, what good music is, and how to know the crap from the good stuff, how to think creatively, and how we should be teaching science the same way, in my opinion. We should be teaching you how to understand what scientists do. You're going to be paying for it later on as a taxpayer, how to understand, creative thinking, how to understand, to evaluate what science, who the great scientists were. So you can get into a discussion with people about science like you might about music or about artwork. And I think we spend too much time blowing things up and changing chemical colors and stuff for people who are never going to do this in the rest of their lives. But I think we should be spending a little more time teaching you how to appreciate science and why it's important in your life, how it creates jobs in the economy, and how everything basically has a root in science somewhere at the beginning. And that's my soapbox for the day, and I'll say Don't get me started on this. Yes, go ahead.
My question follows up on that. I'm a scientist. One of the things I work on is toxic chemicals from tires, including the salmon-killing chemical that Ezra mentioned. We scientists are terrible communicators, and that goes right at Ira's point. And it would be interesting for me to hear what makes a good science story, and how can scientists approach reporters or do a better job of communicating? Are there things you've learned from your experience that might help us scientists learn and do better?
I think scientists often have great stories. They just, like you said, they don't know how to tell them. We were talking about this backstage about how do you interview a scientist? I often just let you talk for a while. Like go on a walk, talk, let you get it out of your system, like the story you want to tell, and then I re-ask you the questions, and then get you to speak in different ways. I think the way you pitch a story is probably one of the things that I struggle the most with scientists, because they will send me this lengthy 2-page email, and by the time I see that, I just want to delete it. But if you can, in the headline, if in the subject line can be quippy and like, fish dye tires, whatever. And then you like say, I have this interesting story about fish that are like being poisoned by the tires you drive, and it's important, and I'm researching that. If you can like delineate it down to like what the story is going to be about versus scientists are often like, they want to tell you about the mode that they did the story and how they did the science. And like, I know that's like the middle of your scientific study that I'm going to read, but please don't send it to me in an email.
Yeah.
If I could add to that, I mean, I think, if you're able to imagine what the headline of an NPR story would be, I think that would help, right? To help focus the story. And I think some questions that I've found have elicited good responses, or sort of a good hook for the story is like, what drew you to this? Or tell me about how you first began looking into this. What got you interested in
Like your
this in the first
hypothesis
place?
too. I ask that all the
Yeah.
time. What was your
Right.
hypothesis for this story?
Yeah.
You
That kind of thing. And also, I love hearing actually that middle section of the journal article, which
Yeah.
is like, how did you do this?
The
Tell me.
methods section.
The methods section
Yeah.
is
Love it.
endlessly fascinating. Like, I want to talk to the biologist that went out into the field and spent a month, taking these like recorders and placing them in all these like remote places so that they could capture the sound of birds in the middle of nowhere. Like, I want to talk to that person, and I want to understand how they crawled through the mud to get to that place, So that's
I think that's actually what we're looking for. We're like, when we hear a science story, we want to know like, how'd you do this? But when we mean that, we don't mean like, please don't regurgitate the methodology,
Right.
but just give us like human language. Like, these people took these recorders, went out and did this thing. These people went to the middle of the lake, stuck a thing in there, and like, if you can, and that's what we're going to include in this story. We want the imagery, what's going to like turn the public on when they read this story, like what's going to make them imagine. If you can put those kinds of things into your pitches, we'll be happier.
Also, I was going to say, like, since we're talking about our favorite parts of scientific papers, I think that oftentimes when scientists pitch stories, they think they're pitching the abstract, which is the little piece at the beginning where you summarize it, but you're really giving us the conclusion, because the conclusions are where you get to kind of stretch out and say, like, well, here's how it might affect other researchers' research, or here's how this could impact people or the environment. It's where you kind of get to do a little speculation, but that's our sweet spot, because we're trying to tell the public, here's how this is going to affect you or your kids or your community. And I also just want to like third the thing about tell us how you did it, especially if you're doing something, where you're crawling through the muck, or like often when I visit with a scientist in their lab, I'll be like, show me this instrument. What did you do with this instrument? Like, tell us, are you working with lasers? Holy crap, tell us that it's lasers. Tell us what you're doing, because that's how people will be able to relate to it.
One last thought on this. Also think about like what journalists you're pitching to. Mm-hmm. Like, you may not want to pitch to me because it might not be my beat area, or maybe my audience isn't the right audience for your study. Maybe you want a broader audience. Maybe you want something more specific. Maybe you want something more of a science magazine to cover it. Like, my audience is a general audience. It's the general public. But if you're like going to be on a podcast, like maybe you want to talk at length, you might want to go on their podcast, So I think about who you're going to pitch to is really important, because I delete a lot of emails because they're not for me.
Last thing I would add to this is I'm reminded of the old joke of how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, right?
Yeah.
If you really want to be a science communicator, you have to practice this. You have to literally set yourself up, and a lot of good universities have departments, their public relations departments will work with the scientists in their divisions to teach them how to speak into a microphone. I remember back in the day, I used to go to Columbia University with a camera, and I would play scientists, they would play journalists, we would switch roles. How to get your message out, it does take practice if you really want to do this the right way. So that's the last. These are all great techniques, but if you don't practice them, you're never going to learn how to do it.
We've all been practicing.
Yeah, practice. Before I get to the audience, let me go to a question from our live stream. Speaking of which, what is the impact of science low literacy on your reporting? How do you adapt your reporting to this low literacy question?
Yeah, I think it requires, I mean, especially when I'm reporting, and I have been reporting on, let's say, one toxic chemical for years and years and years, I'm already in the weeds. And at that point, my editor will often pull me back and say, hey, you need to write this like people who are reading this have never heard of this chemical. Like, let's start there. You need to introduce it like every single time. And so I think some of it is just building that muscle to say, okay, I'm always going to have a few lines that say ethylene oxide is a colorless and odorless gas that does X, Y, and Z, for instance. So I think kind of building that, and I try to, especially when I'm approaching really like jargony topics, imagine a busy working mom of two who is maybe reading my story on Apple News while they're waiting to pick up their kid. Like, what is the information that they need? What is it that they would want to know? What are the questions they would have? So I try to approach my writing in that way.
Yeah. And I think there's not a topic, I mean, I'm thinking of quantum mechanics and things like that, but there's not a topic, even that cannot be explained in a way that is interesting.
Yeah.
And even just hearing scientists be excited by what they're doing, the verbal communication, you never see them on Science Friday, you never see them on the radio, but you hear their excitement, and people will say, wow, if that person is so excited about it, there must be something here, right? And so maybe, and we know that on Science Friday, we have an amazing statistic that 75% of our audience is motivated to do something after they've heard the story, to learn more, to do something, follow up with it. Because they really love these details. They love, because really what science is doing is it's satisfying what theology or what history is where we came from and where we're going. That's what science is really all about. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you. My question is regarding something I just read in the news yesterday regarding the National Climate Assessment and the people who work on that being let go. And I would love your opinion about how that intellectual history of making those climate assessments for the United States is then going to affect the upcoming November climate talks, and what your opinion is going to be. And I love the fact that you have all told us that people are trying to save the data, but this is also within people's heads and their experience of negotiations, and also the scientists that put together this climate assessments for the United States. So I just would love your opinion of what you speculate might happen in November.
Yeah, if it's a fair conclusion, and it seems like it is, that, by virtue of the fact that they've fired or sort of let go all of the researchers who would work on this assessment, meaning that there will no longer be this assessment, we're not going to have this really crucial, important document that the United States puts together. I think what's really critical to remember about the assessment is that the assessment itself is not targeting scientists or other researchers. It's targeting lay people, right? It's trying to communicate with the everyday person, as well as state and local officials and regulators at every level across the United States. It's a common document that everyone can turn to when they want to understand what is the latest science on sea level rise or wildfires. What does this mean for policy making in my city or my state? That's what we're losing when we lose the climate assessment. Yeah. And, internationally, too, I know that during climate negotiations, it is one of the documents that is often referenced in those negotiations. When there are negotiators trying to put pressure on, say, the US or the EU or any other country, that is one of the documents that people turn to. So that is what I think we're losing. I don't know, Ezra.
I know some of the researchers, and they're pretty bummed out.
Yeah.
They live in the Bay Area. But the other thing, like California also has its own assessments.
Right.
We also have our own climate assessments. So we have some of those things that are still happening here. And I think Californians and government are actually looking at that more, because they're very specific to what's happening in the Bay Area, in California, in this county. On the sea level rise stuff, they're based on tide gauges that are relevant here, when the national assessments are a bit too broad. So it is sad, but there is still work happening going on.
And what I will say is also there is a companion to the National Climate Assessment, which is a nature assessment, and that is relatively new, and that is also not being pursued anymore. But I know that some of the researchers that had gotten together and had put a lot of work into that nature assessment are now trying to figure out ways to still put it out on their own without any government funding or support. So it's I suppose, possible that that could happen with the climate assessment as well.
Next question, yes.
Thank you. Ira, thank you so much. I've been a fan of yours for the last 30 years.
I knew I had one
35,
somewhere.
Yeah. And I'm also a science educator. I've been nationally recognized as well as state recognized. And I just want to say to you, there are so many classrooms that do that idea of just instilling love and inquiry and just thought and what it is to be a scientist. My first question might be, would you consider at one of the science panels at some point bringing in some science educators to kind of talk about how it's changed over time? And I imagine that you have done that, but I think it's a really valuable thing. I am also concerned very much with NAEP, which is our National Assessment for Education Progress. Funds have been cut in order for us to actually get that baseline of science knowledge and to figure out where our literary level is in science. And so that's kind of concerning. But my question for all of you is think back to that. You all love science. You probably love science as much as I do. I'm wondering, what was that moment with an educator that you knew that you love science enough to have an entire career with this, as well as writing about it for a lifetime? Thank you.
Annalee?
I have a super vivid memory of being in the first grade and doing a science project where we learned how to make a circuit. And all we were doing was just connecting it up and making a little itsy bitsy light bulb turn on. And I can still feel it in my fingers. It was so incredible to me that I was like, wait, it's just these two wires? Wow! And I actually just went back a few weeks ago, and I'm relearning how to make circuits, and it's much more complicated now because we have LEDs and things like that. And I had that same feeling. I was playing with the little board and putting the two wires in, and I was like, I did it! I made the LEDs light up. So I think it's just that moment where where I connected with this is science, but it's also a thing I can do with my hands, and it's still in my head.
That's cool. When I was a kid, my dad helped me make a windmill for a science fair project, and we won the science fair because he made it. Kind of. And basically, because it was so advanced. That was my first foray. I knew science. I don't think I fell in love with science reporting until I was a journalist, because I was a general assignment reporter first. And then I went out in the field. I was in the Central Valley at the time. We had this 5-year drought, and so all these trees were dying up in the Sierra Nevada. And I went out with a silviculturist. They study trees. They're these basically forest gardeners. And we went out and we looked at all these trees together up in the Sierra National Forest. And I think that was the moment where I was like, oh, this is cool. This is super nerdy, and I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't have a specific memory like that, Annalee, but I just have always been a very nerdy child and loved science and math, and so much so that I pursued a chemical engineering degree and worked in an oil field one summer, and considered my future prospects and considered maybe I want to do a PhD in engineering, and is that something that I wanted to do? But what I realized is I mostly wanted to talk about the science and learn more, but not go so deep and be so invested in just one topic. I wanted to be able to hop around and go wherever my curiosity led me to. And I realized, science journalism is probably what I want to do. I want to talk to scientists and I want to learn about it, but I don't want to actually do the science myself. And so
I think that's a big theme in science journalism, is that we want to be generalists.
Yes.
But if you're going to be a scientist, of course, you have to just have the one thing. You look at the one chemical or the one process that makes the chemical, instead of how does this all fit together? So that's the beauty of being a science journalist, is you can just parachute into a lab and be like, all right, tell me about soft robots.
And somehow they answer your questions. You go there and say, I want to know more. Tell me.
But there was one difference. I was always a geeky kid, and in the basement, I fooled around with electronic stuff just to answer that question about it. And before the World Trade Center was there used to be a block of stuff in New York where you could get surplus stuff on the street and pick it up for next to nothing. And so I used to build these electronic circuits. I know exactly what you're saying. But I used to, when I worked at NPR in Washington, I used to notice the difference between me as a science journalist and all the political journalists. And I used to comment with them about how they get away with murder that I couldn't do as a science journalist.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I would not, if I'm talking to a scientist, you have to show me the data. If I'm going to publish something or talk about it, give me the reports. Tell me why. Give me the data to back it up. These political reporters, they just take words verbatim from the Congress people are interviewing, and they put them on the radio or on television or something without caring about is there any data to back up what they're doing.
Yeah, it changes so fast. Like I noticed political reporters at KQED, their situation changes by the day, right? The news story about this political thing changes in the moment, and especially sometimes now by the hour, by the second. But the science, we have to like show the facts. Like that's a moment, something I'm having to do so much more is like show all my work in stories I'm writing because of this moment. People will email like, how'd you come to this conclusion? Or why didn't you interview this person? So now I'm putting in the stories like everyone I interviewed, even if they didn't like say they wanted to interview, because we want to show all our work. It's like when you're a kid and you didn't want to show your work for the math homework, right? Now I'm trying to show it all the time.
Quick question, last question. We'll see if we have time for a couple. Go ahead.
Two letters that have existed peaceably in the alphabet have now been thrown together for a profound effect. And those two letters are AI. And I'd like to know how you see that affecting what you do today and in the coming future.
AI? Anybody want to?
I can say that like we think at KQED, we had this conversation about AI. I mean, some people feel like it could take over our work, but like if we're providing something that AI can't do, like we're interviewing people about their personal lives and their history and like their hypothesis about why they did a certain thing. Like AI is not doing that. And we can bring a unique story through our journalism that keeps us relevant. So I think that's what we're trying to maintain.
The most immediate, I think, visible use of AI, besides a lot of the noise that we see, is in medicine, where AI can develop molecules that would take years that AI can do quickly. AI can look at scans of your body and tell you things, tell doctors about, or radiologists about things they missed.
Wow.
Other kinds of stuff like that. So medicine, to me, is the most immediate consequence, good positive consequence of AI.
One of the things I think about a lot when I'm thinking of the future of journalism is the use of sensor data, because if you're looking at anything in the environment, you're using sensors. And I think as we go forward, particularly in this sort of anti-science moment, I think we're going to see journalists, especially environmental journalists, using their own sensors, like deploying environmental sensors to figure out carbon loading, to figure out toxins in the environment, to figure out how water is being routed or contaminated. And AI can be incredibly helpful with analyzing the data from those sensors, also for writing little programs to run those sensors. So I think that people who are word people like us, who write in natural language instead of computer languages, we can be using AI to be doing things that were once the purview of people who are gathering environmental data. And so I'm really excited about that. I really look forward to like more environmental data gathering. So let's get out there and do it.
Last question.
I'll quickly ask my last question. I think we've touched on how science and politics are obviously intersecting. I'm a scientist. Some of you have talked about this, but how do you think about presenting your science and telling your stories and like being honest about what's going in politics, but also science is for everyone, and telling these stories in such a way that they're not going to maybe put off people or trying to reach like a broader audience who maybe wouldn't be as receptive? So how do you kind of like think about telling your stories in such a way that like they reach more people, but also being honest about politics and kind of the intersection there?
I have to say, I've given up on the idea that there's this magical broad audience that I would be able to reach if I would just censor my political opinions and perspectives. I don't think that that's real, and I think in order to be honest and in order to have evidence-based assertions in our stories, we have to put that first and not put first this idea of like the magical, town square that we're inventing. We're going to reach as many people as we can, but we can't censor ourselves in order to try to reach some broader audience that may not even exist.
I think you have to be transparent about who you are.
Yeah.
and let your readers or audience figure out, where the truth is in what you're saying and by what you do. And there's this whole issue of what does fair mean? I mean, what does it mean that you're going to present both sides of the story? I mean, this has just been taken to a ridiculous lengths in some of the science stories about the climate or whatever, about what is fair and balanced and things like that. So I think transparency is of utmost importance.
Yeah, I think we're also limited as journalists, and often I'm limited by times or words. So I think people just have to understand that we can't do everything in the amount of time we have. Just like this tonight, we could talk and talk and talk and talk about this, right? But we have to keep it as it is.
Navina, any last words?
Oh, wow. Okay. So that's 0. No pressure there. I think the one thing I would add is, obviously we all have our biases and we need to be transparent about what those are. But I also see sometimes needlessly political framing of stories. For one example, for instance, is, they voted for Trump, then they lost their funding, or then they were fired from their jobs, or what that kind of framing I don't think necessarily adds very much to the conversation. So I would say, on top of being very upfront about what your viewpoints are and where you're coming from, is also if there are ways to frame stories more broadly, then that might help reach a broader audience.
Yeah, well, we've reached the end of our discussion. I want to thank all of you for taking time to be with us today. Navina Sadavina, excuse me for my throat. Navina Sadisivam, a writer and editor at Grist. Ezra David Romero, climate reporter for KQED News. Annalee Newitz, science fiction and nonfiction author. Thank you all for taking time to be with us today. I want to thank all of our audience here. I want to thank our audience out on the internet that's watching our streaming, and special thanks to the people who made tonight possible, especially our amazing partners here at the Commonwealth Club. Thank you for who you are. I want to thank Diana Plasker and the entire Science Friday team who put this together. And a reminder, as you're exiting, there is merch for sale in the lobby. Where can you go and not have merch? And so you can rep your favorite science radio show every day, because you don't have to wait for Friday to have fun with Science Friday. Thank you, San Francisco. Thank you for turning out. Thank you for coming by. Get home safely. We'll see you on Friday.